Welcome to the Sufi Heart Podcast with Omid Safi, featuring teachings and stories from the wisdom of the Islamic tradition. Omid invites you to a meditation on the transformative power of love and recalling the necessity of healing our own hearts through healing the world. If you'd like to support Omid's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Omid.
Hello, friends. I am especially enthusiastic to share this latest episode with you. This is something a little different. It's a conversation with one of the people that I find to be on the cutting edge of that intersection of myth, music, spirituality, discipline, and politics. This conversation is with the host of the widely popular podcast called The Emerald. It's none other than the person that I hold in great reverence and respect, Josh Schrei. And if you've listened to the episodes of The Emerald, you'll know that the conversations that Josh shares are wide-ranging, from the Divine Mother to the need for going beyond simplistic notions of mindfulness, to the importance of guardians and protectors on the spiritual path, and not simply taking in every spiritual impression that comes, to talking about issues of love and animism and trauma, revolution, sound, and more. So Josh is really tapping into a profound level of mythic reimagination. And I would definitely encourage you to give a deep listen. His episodes are not merely about the world of myth and spirituality. The experience of listening to these beautifully produced episodes is itself something that takes you into this mythic universe. And after having admired his work for so long, it was really a joy to get to have this very personal conversation with Josh about spirituality and discipline and where we find ourselves in the world today. And I'm delighted to share it with you. And if you enjoy these kinds of conversations, feel free to join us on one of our upcoming programs for illuminated courses. We're going to have some retreats coming up in Morocco and Turkey. And you can find information for those, as well as our online courses and gatherings, all of it at illuminatedcourses.com. So with that, let us turn into this much anticipated conversation with Josh Schrei, the host of the Emerald podcast.
So I know we got like lots of fun stuff that we could talk about. I always find it kind of interesting to hear a little bit about that fiction of a biography, because it's only in retrospect that we make it linear and we kind of make it make sense. And I'm actually much more interested in the randomness and the unplanned and the eruptions of things that we could have never anticipated, and none of us are finished products also. And so just anything about that journey you care to share, and then we can talk about anything else that you want to talk about.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here and great to be in conversation, and I've enjoyed immensely our conversations for the Emerald podcast, and
Me too.
nice to be in this dialogue. And yeah, my biography is like particularly fictitious, you could say, because I've lived a very Neptunian existence that has taken me to many places and to study with many teachers. And for a very long time, I'd say there was kind of a search for a unifying thread in my life. And it's only until recently with the podcast that I've really, I think, found that. And, I was thinking the other day, somebody was asking me the biography question, and I got kind of taken into like one of my old storage lockers and like where I was looking at this artwork from my teenage years and all these images I used to draw of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas from my Zen Buddhist upbringing, to all my stories of the Hindu deities I used to write down from when we were 13 and living in India, to all these like Taoist diagrams from the internal kung fu practices I was doing when I was a teenager, to my busted instruments and drum sets from being a wannabe kind of musician and storyteller when I was younger. And, I look into that storage locker, and for many years of my life, it's like, well, where's the through line? Where's the connecting thread? Like what, like, how does this all make sense? And through the podcast, I've kind of been able to find that the connecting thread is one that's actually been very alive in so many traditions for so many years, which is this sense of the bardic storyteller who brings musical influence and spiritual influence and travel influence and all of it to bear in kind of a rhythmic, mythic, verbalized storytelling. And I wish sometimes that I could beam that vision to my younger self and say, no, this actually does make sense.
Yeah.
This life of many tentacles, it does make sense. But, if I had done that, then I wouldn't have gone on those great tentacle journeys that led this life to be what it was. And I needed to do that to find the unifying ecstatic thread at the heart of it, I would say. So,
Mm, mm.
um,
Does
yeah.
it feel more like um, you're willing to let go of the desire to impose some unifying system on it, or is it on the contrary that if you step back and let the teachings just kind of percolate, that they have their own underlying unity?
I feel that there is an underlying unity in that in many ways in the modern world we've lost the language for. And so that I think there's many souls for whom they can't readily point to that unifying thread in their lives. And part of that is because I think we've lost the language of ecstasy. We've lost the language of longing for the divine.
Yeah.
And really, ultimately, I look back at all of those facets of my journey and I say, all of this was longing for the ecstatic experience. All of this was longing. So, when I was like, oh, the way I'm going to find it is through rock and roll, or the way I'm going to find it is, in the modern world, that seems very distinct and separate from like studying mythic tradition, or that seems very distinct and separate from, studying Taoist martial arts or something like that. But when we re-find that ecstatic thread, then we find that that thread actually unifies so many things that we once thought were disparate. That, like, because of course the divine has always been accessed musically, and always been accessed through story, and always been accessed through art, and always been accessed, in so many of these different ways, through study, through the mythic study. All of this has been a way of, getting out of our agitated consciousness and into a place where we can find that ecstatic experience. And so once I had that lens, it was like, the great unified field theory in physics. It was like, oh, right. And I think and the reason I'm comfortable talking about it, because I usually don't like to spend too much time kind of talking about me, but like the reason I'm comfortable talking about it is that I feel that there's a lot of people who can probably relate to that. That like, oh, I didn't realize that I was really a devotional poet at the heart of it, or I was really someone who was longing for ecstatic union and finding all these ways of manifesting that, but that all along had been the through line. And so I feel like there has been more of an acceptance of, this is going to take many forms. But one of the beauties of the podcast format is that it's literally a blank, slate. It's a open airwaves, and within that I can combine, Rumi and 90s hip hop and as many of these life influences that I see now were all pointing me towards the ecstatic, and that's become it's become a lens or a container or a vessel that feels like it is big enough to hold all of those wantings and wanderings. And it feels good in my life, in my 50s, to finally find that convergence and that identification of what I was longing for all along, in a way.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And, I hear both in this conversation and in a lot of the podcast episodes that I've listened to, you keep coming back to the mythic and the ecstatic and the embodied. And those seem to be kind of recurrent havens in some ways. And I think I also hear a deep recognition that, this Western Enlightenment thing of just pretending that we're going to think our way to God, it has its purpose, but it has a lot more limitations. So much of what was lost or banished or exiled is precisely what people are craving. And they may not always be able to name it until they witness it. And then it's like, that is kind of what I'm looking for, which I think is part of why, at its best, Rumi, chanting, poetry, yoga, Tai Chi, like all of this is kind of hearkening back to so much of what we've lost in some ways.
Absolutely. I mean, the universe, the divine, is meant to be felt, and it is felt, and it's a felt experience. And like one of the silliest things I could ever imagine is trying to engage in a, rational discussion, trying to prove to another person that the divine exists, for example. It's just like, that's never been how you get there.
Right.
It's an experience, and it has to be experienced experientially. Barbara Ehrenreich has a beautiful book that is about the history of ecstasy, Dancing in the Streets, it's called. And she talks about, how, you don't have to get into an abstract conversation with like a Haitian voodoo practitioner about whether or not this is real or exists. They feel it. They feel it when the energy moves. They feel it when the spirit rises. They feel it, go to an African American church in the midst of like feeling the spirit and be like, well, what actually are you feeling? And it doesn't apply. It just doesn't apply. And sure, those discussions can sometimes be, I guess, like, intellectually enlightening or this kind of thing. But at the heart of it, the experience of being in a body, the experience of this cosmos, I mean, all of this is felt experiential reality. And I was surveying a world in which I felt like a lot of the life had been sucked out of a lot of these ancient stories. And I felt like, in relation to Indian tradition, which is one of the traditions that I've studied the deepest, I felt that, on the one hand, there was kind of this cheapening or minimization of the teachings that was like happening in the modern yoga world. And then on the other hand, there were scholars that were, doing their best to kind of, say, hey, no, this is what the texts actually say, and this is what, and that ignored the fact that in that tradition, for example, everything happens through what's called transmission. Everything happens through the actual movement of the life breath. Everything happens through the whispered word or the chanted syllable, and how it moves us and how it stirs our hearts and takes us into that place of felt recognition. And not just like any old feeling of it, but very specific and very deep qualitative feelings, sustained qualitative feelings of contact with the mystery, with the eternal, with that which is vaster than our immediate cognition. Yet, you can correct me on this, but I believe there's a line in the Quran that says that the divine is closer than the jugular vein. And, closer than the jugular vein. Just really feel into that, right here, pulsing inside you, right now, pulsing inside you, as close as your breath, as close as your next thought, as close as the feeling you get when in the presence of someone you love. Like, this is the divine. It's a force, it's a flow, it's an animate reality. It's not something abstracted and distant and far away. And yes, its faraway aspect is beautiful. Its faraway aspect is, you and I talked about this. Its faraway aspect, as you were saying in that conversation, is, sometimes we feel far away from it, right? Sometimes we feel that distance, and that distance that we feel is part of the journey too. But if we see it as only far away, or non-existent at all, or just an abstraction, or just a concept, or just something that like we're supposed to kind of, show up to church to and get down on our knees before, but we don't really kind of feel it, then, we've taken the life breath out of human experience. It's as close as the next breath. It's right here. It's right now. It's pulsing in the space between you and I. And the revival of this animate heart, this life breath of experience, I think it's vital. I think the loss of that is a huge part of why humans feel empowered to destroy ecology. I think it's a big part of why human beings, you know, um, live separate from one another. It's a big part of how you can kind of abstractly try to find like scriptural justification for like treating each other like dirt. Like all of that is what the consequence of the removal of the actual felt heart of love, of the animate, of the cosmos. And so, you know, in whatever small way that I can, my interest is in helping to return us to that felt heart, helping to hopefully create an experience through which people can feel the immediacy of that pulsing heart, can feel it in their jugular vein, can feel it in the soles of their feet, can feel it in the glint of the eye. That lived, felt experience of it is vital in today's world. And yeah, that's really the heart of what I'm hoping, can grow from the podcast.
Yeah. And, I think you used the word transmission, and transmission can take on lots of different shapes and forms. And I think, at its best, this is absolutely a kind of transmission
Mm.
of something that's, universal and cosmic, even way, way beyond the merely human. And then at the same time, it's got to have roots.
Mm.
It's got to be connected. It's got to benefit from that ancient wisdom. It's not a, do it yourself process. Or you might get there, but it would just take a lot longer.
Mm.
And I'm not sure that many of us have that much time. So it's a beautiful thing to see, the new forms that this kind of transmission is taken today. And it does feel like we're on the cusp of something that in many ways is quite ancient, practices that go back centuries and centuries. And in other ways, maybe it hasn't quite been done this way before.
Mm.
And, I think for someone like me who just has a sense of curiosity about life and the spirit and the sacred, which loathes being bound up in institutions and channels and always has a tendency to erupt. I can't wait to see where the story goes,
Yeah, I'm interested to see where the story goes too.
Yeah.
I think what I've seen is that there are a lot of people who are not fully satisfied with how what you could call neo-spirituality has been expressing itself in kind of a, you could say like free market spirituality, like that the heart of spirituality, like, okay, if it's not going to be archaic religion and the architectures and structures of religion, then it's going to be whatever I make it.
Right.
And that it's really kind of a free-for-all. And so, if I decide on Monday night that I'm a Wiccan and decide on Tuesday night that, I'm a master of the Enneagram and decide on Thursday, then like that's just kind of what it's going to be. And it's like, my life has been kind of an interesting balance in that I've studied in tradition for long periods of my life. And then I've also studied multiple traditions. And what I've learned from that is that, the idea that tradition is totally fixed and totally static just isn't the case. And, I'm sure you can look within your own tradition and see 100 examples of that. Such interesting animate offshoots in the Islamic world. So the idea that there is like the one pure tradition that has never changed and is unbroken and, is always geographically located in the home of its ancestry and everything like that. Well, that's not the case. Tradition moves and morphs and changes and is very, very fluid. And in fact, there are said to be, in certain traditions, animate forces that rule that particular migration and movement and flow. So I think we have to recognize that there is adaptability, movement, change, syncretism, what's called syncretism, that this is the natural way of things. And then within that, if we look at, these beautiful branchings of tradition and offshoots of tradition, then we can look at, well, what are foundational commonalities? What don't they lose even as they're shifting and changing form? And that can give us an insight into like, okay, there are things that are tried and true that perhaps need to stay more stable about our practice, like practicing regularly and often,
Right.
for example. Like practicing regularly and often is something that you see in every single tradition everywhere. It is a morning honoring of the rising sun, or it is a daily gratitude for all the concentric circles of life, or it is the prayer that happens 5 times per day, or it is the, various points throughout the day when one reconnects in whatever way one does. That is a foundation that you will find common to all traditions. That I don't think you can change and get like the same effect out of spiritual practice, right? If the spirituality becomes like, well, yeah, I practiced once, like, yeah, I practiced once like 7 months ago and now I'm going to practice tonight. And then, yeah, I don't know, I'll practice like, that's not going to work. So there does have to be a foundation, and that foundation can be based on what has worked for traditions, for thousands upon thousands of years. And that foundation stays fairly consistent. How people structure rituals stays fairly consistent. What lives at the heart of those ritual practices stays fairly consistent. Repetition is a fairly consistent element. Verbal repetition, saying things aloud is a fairly consistent element. The use of some type of, offering or candle or prayer or spoken word or flame or whatever it is, like a sense of offering and coming with offering stays fairly consistent. So there are these deep consistencies. And then within that, recognizing the fluidity, recognizing the beauty of you know, even, a syncretic altar that has Mother Mary and Kali right next to each other and Hecate right next to each other. Some people get ashamed, some people are, and this is a function of the times we're living in. We are living in times of enormous cultural crossover, and we're going to see religious crossover and traditional crossover. And what's important to me is that the foundations get carried over and that we find a way to recognize that movement and mystery and fluidity as well and find that balance.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking back to, that earlier example you gave of every ecstatic tradition has music and has poetry and has myth and story. And I mean, just to take, music as one example, if you pick up a violin today and play it for 10 minutes and put it down, and then tomorrow start piano and then go to drums, then, well, you're never going to really master anything. And that, I think, one other way that we could call that repetition, and it's a very unsexy word these days, is discipline.
Mm.
And I do think that, spiritual traditions do call for a measure of discipline, repetition, even mastery. But then, what you notice is that it's the musician who's really mastered his or her craft. Those are the ones who are usually the most willing to improvise. Those are the ones who are willing to, break the musical scales and collaborate with someone from a parallel musical sphere. And jazz is
And
a great
can,
example of that, and the improv.
yeah, I mean, and can do it successfully.
Right,
And it's the
right.
thing, like, sure, you can pick up a saxophone and try and play a John Coltrane solo, right? It took him years of discipline to find that place of improvisation.
Yeah.
And, it gets at, I think, fundamental modern discomfort around things like structure, order, hierarchy, which are worth going into and worth unpacking and worth rerouting and, worth exploring. But within that, we've created such a dichotomy between, discipline and artistry.
Right.
It's like when you listen to a beautiful piece of music, you're listening to discipline. Like, that's exactly what you're listening to. You are listening to the fruits of discipline. And, I use orchestral terminology quite a bit to describe the nature of the cosmos, because one can get into these topics. You can talk about how there's like a pattern to harmonics and an order to harmonics and, chord progressions and these type of thing. And, when you bring it to a musical level, it's hard to argue with. For some reason, we tend to, in the modern world, I think, like spirituality is like the one thing that we're supposed to just kind of figure out for like everything else. It's like, oh yeah, of course, if I want to learn to play the guitar, I'll take a guitar lesson. If I want to, and obviously that comes from a deep wound around religious institutions that told people what to do and how to feel. And, and so the rebound from that is like, nah, who is to mediate my experience of the breath of life? Who is to get in the way of what I know of this vast cosmos? And there's truth to that, but to me, that's like the initial kind of adolescent freeing themselves from the potentially abusive parents, right, kind of phase. And then eventually that adolescent needs to realize like, oh, like this is a harmonic technique too. This is a discipline too. And if I'm actually going to come into the full expression of my relationship with the cosmos, there is a structural discipline that can be essential for that. And that does not mean, it's like not every learning environment is a, Victorian British boarding school, right? Like not every, yeah, yeah, I'm actually doing a whole episode on this and some of our reactivity around structure and order in the modern world. When you look at indigenous traditions, when you look at animate traditions the world over, it doesn't matter if you're talking about incredibly small scale cultures. It doesn't matter if you're talking about matrilineal cultures or patrilineal cultures. You are going to find deep initiatory structures at the heart of those traditions, there has to be a container of some kind that can anchor that mystery. And wise people know how to anchor that mystery, and it happens through the creation of a harmonic structure and order. The degree to which that scares the modern, mind, it's like it scares the modern mind, like the postmodern, kind of liberal mind that is still in reactive rebellion to kind of the old archaic orders, gets terrified by that. But I think we need to reroute our relationship with discipline. We need to re-anchor our relationship with structure and order. A piece of music is intricately ordered. A piece of music is any music that you love, even the people who try to do like John Cage style, like any piece of music that you love is intricately structured and ordered, and its harmonics are delicately balanced, and its pulse is metered, and it has a regularity to it, or it would not be recognizable to the human ear. And, that moves outwards from just music into how we structure our communities and how we structure our ritual practices and how we reconnect. There is a vast difference, in doing a daily acknowledgement gratitude practice to the concentric circles of being, all the way from, the local ecosystem to the grand mysteries. There is a profound difference in doing that once or twice a year and doing that every single day. So it starts to build rhythm. And from a yogic perspective, what you're building is heat. You're actually building a friction. You're actually building a heat. And that heat is alchemical. It burns things. It moves things. Things become more malleable and fluid, and transformation happens more readily when there's heat to that alchemic fire. And that heat is created through repetition. There has to be repetition, or else, what is it?
Yeah, I think that's really the beautiful insight about, we have this wound, this civilizational trauma of, the overbearing, cruel parental generation, which sometimes looked like institutional religion or the state or kind of whatever. And then now people are wanting to pivot away from that. Who are you to tell me how to seek the breath of life and how to feel God closer than the beating of, my own heart? But I think what we sometimes miss out on is, if that's the knee-jerk response, then we can also end up in a place which is only about affirmation and never about transformation.
Mm.
And we can end up in a place where it's still about self-help, self-happiness, self, at the same time that all of these traditions are trying to tell us it ain't all about the self, honey. At least not the small s self that you're thinking of, and that we're part of this interwoven, much larger, grander cosmic matrix. And that takes devotion, that takes service, that takes justice, that takes harmony. And all of those kinds of metaphors pull us out of where we could end up if we're only going on the I'm spiritual, not religious, one-way train.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard something about this on the Weird Studies podcast some years ago, but they were talking about how if it's just whatever you want whenever you want it, then what are the stakes really? Like where is the transformational spark within that? And I remember my friend Rose, who is from the Santa Clara Pueblo in northern New Mexico, who I've had on the podcast a couple times. After COVID ended and she and her Pueblo community were doing ritual again, I was hanging out with her like a couple days later, and she was like, "Oh, we had like the first, ritual gathering since all this stuff went down, and I was asking her how it was, and she was like, oh, it was terrible, like we had to sit there for like 7 hours and my knees were like completely killing me, and it was so good to be back. And, and that's not to say that it all has to be this kind of no pain, no gain type situation, but there is a measure of friction involved, because our relationship with the divine, our relationship with the universe, our relationship with nature is a relationship. It's relational. And in that relationship, there are more than two players. And in that multiplicity of relationality, we have responsibilities, many traditions tell us. We, have to understand, like a lot of people, I talk about animism a lot on the podcast. And animism, for some in the modern world, kind of comes to mean this like beautiful eternal love affair with nature. Well, animism in traditional context means a whole lot more than a beautiful unconditional love affair with nature. It means a deep measure of responsibility and a deep level of recognized reciprocity. And recognized reciprocity doesn't just mean like, oh, when I go out into the woods, I kind of throw up my hands and say, thank you, Mother Nature. No, reciprocity relates to every aspect of how we interact with the world and with each other, and bringing consciousness to that and recognizing that there's ways to be more in alignment and ways that take us out of alignment. And that type of discernment, if it's just everything I feel is totally valid, right? If it's just that, then we don't get those places where we have to actually do some transformative work around how we are in relation with everyone else. And, within that, there are numerous spiritual traditions and teachings around like, if you really want to find out how you're doing, like ask some other people about like, some reflection, some feedback, like it's all fine and good for me to think like, hey, I'm doing great. And I got my, way of connecting, and that's that. And like, well, how does my wife think I'm doing? And like, what kind of feedback would she have to offer? And, how do my kids think I'm doing? And how do the people in my immediate practice community think that I'm doing? And there always has to be that reflection of relationality, and that reflection of relationality is going to bring friction. Yep. It's inevitably going to bring friction. For anybody who's practiced in a community, there's going to be friction there. There's going to be that one annoying person. Gurdjieff talks about the one annoying person, and then it turns out to that person, you're the one annoying person. You're the one who's like really grating and getting under their skin. So what do you do with that? What do you do when you're not just the one determining all of it, and it's not just a free for all? It's like us actually in relation. And that's hard work. And that, that demands of us that we evaluate everything about, ourselves and how we're interacting with others. And, what could spirituality possibly look like without that, though? How can it possibly take us to any place of actually alchemizing, actually getting through the kind of nitty-gritty of existence to build, a container that can hold love between people and between us and the planet? So there has to be a measure of us navigating the friction of relationality within it. Otherwise, like, and that's an interesting thing, because, sometimes these kind of free form neo-spiritualities get, lumped together as like a rebellion against the dominant culture. But in many ways, they are deep reinforcements of the dominant culture. They are reinforcements of that individualism, of that, well, I get...
Also,
capitalism. That's what I mean.
Yep.
That's what I mean. Like, that I get to do whatever I want, whenever I want. It's like there's two sides. Colonialism isn't just, the strict hierarchical law and order. Colonialism is also the like, hey, I'm stumbling through this forest and I get to do whatever I want. And recognizing that as it plays itself out in some neo-spiritual circles, I think is very, very important. It's like, no, like this is a perpetuation of some of the things that, we're supposedly trying to regrow and repattern. And let's look at that. And I think I think what's called for is a deep reassessment of our relationship with deeper structures and deeper relational orders and deeper relational ways of being.
Yeah. I have a very dear friend of mine in Australia who sent me the episode you had done on guardians.
Mm.
She was like, you have got to listen to this. And that was such an insightful one, because I think you're right. There's that temptation of, um, I'm a goddess, you're a goddess, we're just going to Mother Nature, and the whole universe is benevolent. And I don't know of a single genuine spiritual tradition that looks at this well-populated cosmos and says it's all benevolent forces, and there are um, terrifying forces, mischievous forces, awesome, awful kind of forces, and you better tread lightly and reverently and know how to ward them off.
Mm.
And I think that also calls for a kind of wisdom and discernment and transmission, that's just healthy to cultivate that sense. And and then even at the mere human level, I mean, the Sufis usually put it as we need mirrors. It's, I don't know if you ever have that experience of like you hear your own voice, or back in the days where, this is before dating ourselves, but like, phones used to have these devices where people would record their messages, and you would listen to your own voice and you'd be like, oh my God, is this what I really sound like? And that's what a real friend is. They hold up a mirror for us to get to see the parts of ourselves that we can't see, or we're worked so hard to block. And if we're really fortunate, then that friend can be a romantic friend, it can be a, lover, it can be whatever. They're going to say, yes, this part of you is still in the process of being cooked, of maturing, but I love you anyway, and I'm not going anywhere. But we oftentimes can't see those parts of ourselves. And so it calls for a community, even if the community is just one other person.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. That reflection, that episode that you're talking about, I talk about in that episode the ideal of being open that we have, in the modern neo-spiritual world. And it's easy to see where that ideal comes from. When a lot of these trends got set in motion in the pendulum swing between the 50s and the 60s, the 1950s and the 1960s. And you have a society that was, very closed, very repressed in certain ways, very stifling, old orders that were stifling. And so, of course, there was a rebellion against that. And that rebellion was toward what can be called the open, like openness, love and openness. And that love is openness, this kind of sense that love is openness. And if we open ourselves to the love of the universe, then that's, of course, something that everybody would ultimately want to do. And, this is an interesting thing, because from the perspective of many, you could say, spiritist traditions or animist traditions, you don't actually want to be open to everything. There are things that you don't want in the house. There are, just like you don't want the doors of your house, so wide open that like you could put your family in harm's way. Like there are forces in this universe that you actually don't want to be open to. And that love isn't necessarily just blanket openness. I grew up with parents who were coming out of that 60s wave,
Mm.
And in many ways, they thought love was letting me do what I wanted to do. You know, they thought love was like, oh, he'll figure it out. Like, enough of this kind of, trying to box him in and everything like that. Well, sure, if you're boxing in the child too much, that has consequences. But there are also consequences to saying like, oh, the world is yours, go figure it out, you know, and, constructing, what does it mean to construct a good nest for little ones to grow in? It means a combination of openness and boundary. And that openness, that relationship between openness and boundary, I think is at the heart of really all spiritual practice that I've seen. And there's a tremendous line from Jesus where he says, let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. And anything else is where evil tends to get in. I can't remember the exact wording, but that sense of like knowing what to say yes to and knowing where to put up boundary, it's like that is the discerning navigation of this world of duality, right?
Yeah.
And we've, in the adoption of, that 60s wave was very enamored with certain Indian non-dual schools that, you know, wanted to get people out of like what you could call an overly dualistic way of perceiving life, but took uninitiated Westerners,
Mm.
real like kind of spiritual children and spiritual infants, right to the place of like, it's all good, it's all holy, it's all one, and skipped the 30 years of discernment practice that people who are actually on those non-dual paths would have to go through, along the way of feeling that, yes, ultimately there is the great, oneness, but there's a lot of steps between here and ultimately.
Right.
And in those steps between here and ultimately, the way that I navigate this space is with discernment and boundary. And
Mm.
that discernment and boundary, that mirror that you're talking about, is absolutely, it's absolutely essential and absolutely vital. And, I see over and over again, I see the kind of, well, it's like a conflation of all the things we're talking about. You know, the like the spirituality of lack of discernment and lack of definition and lack of boundary, kind of self-justifying itself through the adoption of a supposedly non-dual philosophy, when in reality, those non-dual systems had very codified ways in which people were to live their lives. It wasn't just like, everything I do at this music festival is God. Right? It was,
I've been to a few music festivals, and it's not all God. There's a
it's
bunch
not
of
all good. Yeah. And this takes me, I'd be interested to hear some of your thoughts on this too, because, it's an interesting thing. I see, for example, like in the modern progressive world, like there is no problem in identifying, like you could say, evils as they exist within like the structural hierarchy of systems or within, the oppressive powers of the world. And but then when it comes to like translating that to like, oh, that evil, or if you don't like to use the word evil, that kind of disharmony, that is a force that can also present in my life and how I'm living my path of discernment. I see much more, you could say, openness and permissibility on the individual level, whereas those critiques are kind of reserved for like the systemic structures. And that's where I kind of want to, get us back to an activism of Dr. Martin Luther King or Gandhi, who are always looking at like, no, the patterns that you see reflected in oppressive systems, these are patterns that are just as likely to take hold of us. They're just as likely to manifest in us. And so an inseparable part of the practice is that we have to be looking at that in ourselves and seeking to root out certain tendencies within ourselves. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I'd be interested to hear your perspectives on that.
It's we've just wrapped up the university semester here, and it's been really sweet because I had one seminar on Sufism and one seminar on Dr. King and Malcolm X
Mm,
in the same classroom back to back, and we spend a good few weeks looking at the later part of Dr. King, and in particular Riverside Church, which to me is like the most prophetic speech in sort of American religiosity.
mm,
And it's when he lays out the triple giant of evil of racism, materialism, militarism, um, and the over here and the over there being wrapped up. But the brilliant part about it is exactly this thing that you're talking about, is that he starts out by talking about, I'm here to break the silence of my own soul.
mm,
All right. It's not only that structural institutional critique out there, and it's not even Trump is evil and Netanyahu is evil, though they are. But it's really uh, I'm also complicit. What's my own accountability? What's the way in which I myself have not allowed this greater kind of harmony, of love, the overflowing of love, of establishing justice to take root? And when you're talking about that, saying yes to everything as being something that can actually be harmful, quite harmful. There's this beautiful, beautiful Rumi story. It's pretty well known, um, and it's about a person who's going to see the friend, and the friend in Sufi language is always a code word, partially for God, although it can also be this friend and this friend. And it says that, the person comes to the friend's door and knocks and hears a voice from the inside saying, "Who is it?" And he goes, "It's me." And the friend from inside says, "How can it be me when I'm already here?
mm,
Go away, be banished, be exiled." And it says that the man spends 30 years in exile, uh, suffering, reflecting, cooking, having friction with his own ego. And he goes into that wide open desert of reflection and inner inspection, which is really, I mean, that's the hard part of the spiritual path.
mm,
That's the part that's about work and effort and struggle, and you fall on your face again and again and again. And he comes back, same friend, same door, knocks again, but he's learned a few things. Same voice comes, "Who is it?" And now he's able to say, "Why, it's you."
mm,
And then the voice says, "Well, since it's me, me, come into me,
mm,
because there can only be one I here." So it's like we're trying to get to that place of non-duality, of absolute oneness, which to me is at the heart of every mystical tradition. But we can't get there as long as each one of us wants to put the ego on the throne of the cosmos, whether it's an
mm.
individual or a race or a nation or a species. And there does have to be that, heading off into the desert and the plain and really struggling with, what if I'm not the center of it all? What if the best that I can be is a interwoven, harmonious part of this matrix, but the only being that can speak in the I is the one?
Mm.
And I think it's a very powerful story for me, um, because not only of where it ends up, but what it takes to get to that point.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that story. Yeah, you know, I think it's created a very interesting dynamic where it's, and I think modern civilizational reality, like individualist modern culture, will find any way possible to turn anything into kind of a ego-driven individualist sport. um, but it's created an interesting dynamic, and particularly the like non-dualism piece as it applies to this. Like, of course, ultimately, this is the nature of things as recognized by tradition after tradition after tradition. But if everything then becomes kind of, one of the issues with it is that as it imagines that universal self, it kind of only imagines itself. It is imagining the small self on a grand scale. And within that, I think it becomes hard to recognize potential pitfalls. It becomes hard to recognize what in animist traditions would be called malevolent forces. It becomes hard to recognize evil as it plays out in oneself and in one's life.
Right.
Um, you know, when, like, how does a culture that wants to valorize for very good and very powerful reasons social inclusivity, say, but then how does that translate to, you know, again, this feeling in kind of modern discourse that, like, you know, again, all feelings are valid, all feelings are to be entertained equally. Well, you know, feelings certainly aren't to be squashed down, right? Emotions are meant to move. Motion, there is motion in the word emotion. They are meant to move. But might there be certain feelings that you actually want to kind of like shoo off a little bit and say this isn't helpful, or say, what, I know enough about myself to know that I get grouchy at night, and like if I'm trying to have this deep meaningful conversation with my wife about our relationship, it's best done in the morning. Like, that's a very simple, elegant example. But also, like, how much is jealousy informing the way that I interact on the internet? Or how much is revenge, like a want for revenge or a want to make other people suffer who are at the heart of some of these systemic, things. Like, and then in the animate, from the what I would call the animate perspective, we have to recognize that those feelings have quality, they're forces, and that those forces, when taken to their 10th degree, are in fact causing a lot of the things that are going on in this world. The propensity towards selfishness or greed or jealousy that I might feel is the same force that, when magnified, might cause, a dictator or, someone in a position of political power to do horrible things. And, it's kind of popular now to say, well, like, look at them, like you said, like, the two big ones, Trump and Netanyahu, right? To look at them and say, you know, they are evil and I'm not, right? So then you get into these deep questions, which you and I have talked about a little bit. But if the alternative that's coming from us is based in rage and vengeance and comes from that place of wanting to supplant those oppressive powers, and the means through which we do it is rage and vengeance, right? And we take for a minute the sense from animate traditions that rage and vengeance are actually forces, and that if we're providing a vehicle for them to grow and amplify in the world, that what we create when we topple them might be full of rage and vengeance also, right? That's a very important, like, that understanding of, no, there are, you know, toxicities, however you want to describe them, forces, there are feelings that might arise in me that it's actually very good for me to work on just like letting go down the river and not entertaining and not allowing to fester, so they don't turn into full-blown vengeance. So yes, they turn into action in the name of love. And one of the most powerful things you said in our discussions is when you talked about, sometimes, when you love someone, even when you try to love the oppressor, you love them, and that means you try to get them to stop doing the thing that's harming them. You can be as dedicated and devoted as an activist as you want, and we all should be, I feel, taking action in this time in the ways that we take action. But you can also recognize that if the means through which that is expressing itself is solely, rage and vengeance, like that those forces have a life of their own, and they will amplify and grow too, and they will grow where space is made for them to grow. And if we create a lot of space for rage and vengeance to grow, there are going to be consequences for that, and there's going to be consequences on us, and there's going to be consequences in our own hearts. Like, say we don't topple, the guys up there, and then we're left with the rage and vengeance that we've been kind of allowing to grow and fester. It's like we have to find a way, and I don't know a single spiritual tradition that'll tell you otherwise, honestly. We have to find a way to work with those things within us and to discern, what is going to help us grow and align, and what is detrimental to the health of us and the health of our immediate friends and families and communities and ultimately our world. And I would like to see spirituality, and this is why I like, cosmic non-dualism is beautiful, but, I think we have to have some pretty clearly thought out understandings about discernment and duality and the navigation of duality, and even a word that, people might be comfortable using when it applies to people, but not so much to forces of nature. I think we have to look deeper into evil. I think we have to look at what that is and how it can take hold of people. And I figured that we could get into this stuff because you're, a deeply studied and practiced person coming from a religious background. And I think these types of questions, spiritual questions, but these deep religious questions about like the nature of evil and this kind of thing, I think they're deeply important right now.
It is. And there's this beautiful, very unsettling statement from the Prophet Muhammad when someone had asked him about Satan. And Islam in general doesn't dwell so much on Satan. It's much more concerned about the ego and egoic qualities, and it doesn't have a whole lot of patience for the kind of Bugs Bunny version of Satan as this red guy with a pitchfork jumping up and down in the middle of the flames and everything. And but I mean, this is not a dualism of God versus Satan, and we don't know who's going to win sort of at the end. It's but on this one occasion, someone asked him, the prophet, very specifically about Satan, and rather than pointing to only an externalized being, he said, Satan is that which flows inside the bloodlines of humanity.
Mm.
And people ask him then, even you also have some of this? And his answer was, I do, except that I made mine harmonious with God.
Mm.
But there's that sense that I'm not somehow immune from all of this, but mine has surrendered its egoic tendency to that greater cosmic divine will. And I think that
it's been alchemized.
It's been alchemized.
Yeah.
And it has a heat and it has a friction, and that process of getting it to become harmonious is what cooks us.
Mm.
But it's something that jokingly and not jokingly I've shared with a lot of my friends, that I used to really have a more naive view of evil and the dark side of the force and everything. And a few heartaches in life, including a divorce I would never wish on anyone, have really led me to see that there is such a thing as the dark side of the force, and that there's tremendous power in it. And there are people who derive their reason to live and their ability to get up in the day from that very negative energy. Now, I don't think it's the healthiest one. I don't think it's the most beautiful one. But to pretend that it's not real, and to pretend that it's merely an illusion, I think that's really setting yourself up for a very rude awakening. And maybe what you want is to be able to hold up a mirror and to say, yes, this has power, but is this the most beautiful way to live in terms of the impact that it has on your own soul and on the souls of people around you? How is this not polluting your own heart, your own existence? And if you cannot persuade that person, yeah, you still have a responsibility to protect others.
Mm.
When you're talking about no spiritual tradition says to be open to every force out in the universe. We just got back from Morocco, and we were in these magnificent gardens, beautiful, beautiful, luminous gardens, which are all intended to be an echo of paradise. And I was telling them that, our word paradise obviously ultimately comes through Greek from ancient Persian gardens, which were always a walled garden. So paradise was never just an open meadow, right? It might be big enough to encompass, God willing, the whole of creation, but originally paradise was also a walled garden. And if our hearts are supposed to be the kingdom of God on earth, and if they're supposed to be a garden in which others can seek shelter, they deserve to have walls around them. And not every, malevolent soul deserves to have a chance to trample in that garden. I think what you want to have is that, again, the yes and the no. You want to have walls, protective walls, but then when do you let down those walls? When does the wall become a drawbridge? How do you make sure that the things that are protecting you from certain spirits or certain people or certain tendencies, how is that not in turn becoming a prison? And can it be a selectively, there's a word for membranes that let things come through.
Semi-permeable.
Semi-permeable, yeah. How can it be a permeable kind of a membrane? So that there's a measure of selectivity and intention involved in that. And the same in terms of our dealing with the spirit world, the demon world, the world of ancestors. Not all of your ancestors were really great people. Some of them were really bad, terrible assholes, and many of them have unfinished work, and they're not done. And we wish them well. We hope they complete their journey. But, I think instead of sometimes being like, I call on the power of the ancestors, let's be a little more specific. Which ancestors are we calling on?
Yeah, and which spirit beings and which, because, in the era of modern freeform ritual experimentation, people are calling on all kinds of forces. And, I recognize the longing for that call. I recognize it. And, you know, but then we can anchor it again in traditional knowledge that tells us, like, oh, well, if you call something, it's good to know what it likes to eat and what type of boundary needs to be placed around it. And like, it's good to know its ecosystem. It's good to know the permutations of calling that thing. And often, and I've just seen this as like a tendency, and because I think the previous spiritualities felt very confined, but there's a tendency to want to call the wild one or call the, you know, and, you look at how, like, these, you could say, more dynamic energies are dealt with in their ecosystems. You don't just call that one. You don't just call the trickster or the toppler or the or the utterly unhinged force. Each one has its place to play and its seat at the table, and you approach that carefully. You approach, and you give each one its due and its time to thrive. And they thrive at different times of the lunar cycle, and they thrive at different times of the year. And it's not just like, okay, today I'm going to call anything and everyone and hope something sticks and hope someone lands, and hope that the people in my little ritual here get their money's worth. And that's another big thing, with the neo-spirituality, is that it can get into a performative element where it's like, oh, I've got to make people feel something. I've got to make people, and again, I think the measure is like, how is this rhythmically over time? How does this translate over time? How does this feel? How does this translate into the actual, root network of our community and our practice over time? How does this help us come into better relation? Not, can I get my mind blasted, or, can we call the, wild being who comes and rattles the shutters and stuff like that. There are times when that will happen. There are times when, exciting forces show up in ritual spaces. Yeah, but, that's not the point of ritual. The point of ritual is a deeper relationality and bringing us closer to that. And that is going to involve a lot of deep relational knowledge that isn't always going to look sexy. It's not always going to look dramatic. It's not always going to look like the most fun thing. A lot of ritual practice, like Rose was saying, a lot of ritual practice sucks. It's like, oh man, Staniswar Timosina was telling me about the ancestral practice he had to do, in a discussion about ancestors. And it's like he had to fast for days and chant for hours. And like, he was like, yeah, this wasn't pleasant. Like, that ancestral puja was not pleasant. It was deeper relationality, but it wasn't, pleasant. So I think bringing that grit into our practice is important, and that friction into our practice is important. Yeah.
Absolutely. Are there other themes you want to make sure we get to touch on? I feel like I've gotten to ask so many things that I had wanted to just be in conversation with you about. Are there any big areas?
Well, I mean, when we've already touched on like non-duality and evil, and like we're hitting on some of the deepest themes there are. But for today, no, I'm gonna have to get going in a minute here, so we can. Yeah, I mean, I guess like when the piece when you were talking about, like, it's all, the sense that like that evil is an illusion, or to jump to that place of, the mistranslation of Rumi's field, like where it's beyond right doing and wrong doing when that isn't even actually the original language of it. To understand in the ultimate sense, like the ultimate sense, all of these dynamic movings and turnings, sure, from the perspective of the universal consciousness, like aren't labelable and aren't, um, quantifiable. And that's a beautiful feeling that one can have in a particular state of ecstatic union with the divine. One can feel that. That doesn't take away from the fact that the vast majority of our practice is about discernment and is about navigating actual relationalities, and that the relationality lives right at the heart of it. And if it's not bringing us into deeper relationality, then it may not be serving its ultimate transformative purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, we're saying two things at the same time, many things at the same time. On one hand, uh, or on one wing, as I prefer to say, there's the need for the ecstatic, the mythic, the somatic, the bodily, and absolutely yes to that. And then, with the other wing, and, birds have two wings and they can only soar if the two wings are learning to harmonize with each other. There's also the patience, grit, discernment, protection. I think that's on the other wing. And maybe I'll just let this be the last thing that I'll say, and then wanted to know if you had any last words. I was reading with some of our community members this unbelievably gorgeous ascension account of a great Sufi, by Yazid. And I mean, he basically goes in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad. He ascends through heaven. He meets with all the angels, and on his way towards experiencing the beloved, God, kind of most directly, most embodied. But he's going through the 7 layers of heaven, and at each level, he sees the most extraordinary things: birds and flowers and angels whose body is in one heaven and their heads is in another one. And he takes it all in. Like, he doesn't deny any of it. He takes it all in. But the only way that he's allowed to advance is if at every turn he says, "This is not what I came for."
Mm.
And he doesn't say it's Maya. He doesn't say this is an illusion. He doesn't say my mind is playing tricks. It's beautiful. He takes it, he glorifies it. And then it's like that Jedi thing of like, this is not what I came for. And only when he does that is he allowed to advance and advance and advance. And there's something really moving about, we're all longing for that sense of ecstasy and something that moves you, inspires you, ruptures you out of the mundane of existence. And then at some point, how do we not become experienced junkies? And how to remember that, that the path of transformation isn't always sexy and dramatic. And sometimes it's like slow, patient tending to the soil, and watering a tender shoot. And who is it that we've come for, and what is it that we didn't come for? I think learning that balance, to me, is right on the pulse of where I think we find ourselves today.
Yeah, beautiful. And it takes me back to our musical analogy, in which we can hopefully come to the place where the discipline and the improvisation are one thing, where they melt into one thing.
Yeah.
And where the structure and the flow, merge as harmoniously as they do within water, for example.
Beautiful. Love it. Love it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate you deeply. And let's do this again whenever you feel like it.
Yeah, I would love to. More than happy to have more discussions. Thanks for having me.
Süleyman kuş değilim, bir değilim. Süleyman kuş değilim, bir değilim. Süleyman